The morning of April 27, 1945. Near the ruins of what was once the Bavarian town of Dachau, a column of women trudged forward under armed escort. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense, yet they wore fragments of uniforms, threadbare and stained with the dust of collapse. Nurses from field hospitals, clerks who had typed orders for officers now dead or fled, radio operators whose voices had once carried commands across collapsing fronts. Now they were simply prisoners, herded toward an uncertain fate by American soldiers whose faces showed neither cruelty nor kindness, only the weary efficiency of men who had seen too much. Among them walked Greta Hoffman, 23 years old, her hair still pinned beneath a cap that had once signified her role as a Wehrmacht auxiliary. She had spent the last 3 years working in a signals unit, transcribing messages, monitoring frequencies, believing the propaganda that told her Germany's victory was inevitable. Now, as Allied tanks rolled past the column with casual dominance, she understood how thoroughly she had been lied to. The first Americans she saw up close were young, impossibly young, their uniforms crisp despite weeks of combat. They chewed gum, an oddity that caught her attention immediately. The rhythmic motion of their jaws seemed almost insolent in its casualness. One soldier, barely older than 20, lit a cigarette and offered it to the woman beside Greta. She hesitated, then took it with trembling fingers. No shouting, no blows, just the quiet exchange of tobacco between captor and captive. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The propaganda had prepared Greta for brutality. For months, Goebbels' broadcasts had painted the Americans as monsters, barely restrained savages who would subject German women to unspeakable horrors. She had heard whispers from other auxiliary workers about mass executions, about camps where prisoners starved while their captors laughed. But as the column moved through the spring countryside toward a temporary holding center, what struck Greta most was the silence. Not the silence of terror, but the silence of shock. The women around her were processing the same dissonance she felt, the collision between expectation and reality. The holding center appeared on the horizon just before dusk. Barbed wire encircled rows of canvas tents and hastily constructed wooden barracks. Guard towers stood at intervals, manned by soldiers whose rifles seemed almost decorative in their casual handling. Greta had expected chaos, the kind of desperate overcrowding she had heard described from the Eastern Front. Instead, she found an order. Strict military order, but order nonetheless. They were processed one by one. Names recorded in ledgers by clerks who struggled with German pronunciation. Heights measured. Basic medical examinations conducted by army nurses who worked with brisk professionalism. Greta stood in line, watching the woman ahead of her stumble over an English phrase, watching the American medic slow her speech and gesture patiently until understanding emerged. When it was Greta's turn, the nurse pointed to a chair and said something incomprehensible. Greta sat. A thermometer was placed under her tongue. Her pulse was taken. The nurse made notes on a clipboard, then handed Greta a small card with a number written on it. No brutality, no humiliation. Just bureaucracy, as mundane and impersonal as any administrative process she had known in the Wehrmacht. They were assigned to barracks in groups of 30. Inside, Greta found wooden bunks stacked 2 high, thin mattresses, stuffed with straw, and wool blankets that smelled faintly of mothballs and military storage. It was Spartan, yes, but dry, intact. After months of sleeping in basements during air raids, after weeks of fleeing westward through bombed cities, the simple presence of 4 walls and a roof felt almost luxurious. Then came the first meal. The women lined up outside a mess tent, metal trays in hand, uncertain of what to expect. Greta had grown accustomed to watery soup and black bread, to rations that grew thinner as Germany's supply lines collapsed. She expected prison fare to be worse. Instead, the American cook behind the serving line ladled thick beef stew onto her tray, added a pile of mashed potatoes, and placed 2 thick slices of white bread beside it. Greta stared. The woman behind her gasped audibly. "Is this real?" someone whispered in German. Greta carried her tray to a wooden table and sat in stunned silence. Around her, women were doing the same, staring at food that seemed impossible. The beef was tender, flecked with carrots and onions. The potatoes were creamy, topped with a pat of butter that melted into golden pools. And the bread? The bread was soft, still warm, the kind Greta had not tasted since before the war. She lifted a piece to her mouth and bit. The texture was so foreign after years of sawdust-laced loaves that tears sprang to her eyes. Beside her, a former nurse named Ilse ate slowly, methodically, as though afraid the food would vanish if she moved too quickly. "They fed us," she murmured. "They actually fed us." It was the first crack in the facade they had all been taught to believe. That night, lying on her bunk, Greta listened to the whispered conversations echoing through the barracks. Some women refused to accept the kindness as genuine, insisting it was a tactic, a way to soften them before the real horrors began. Others spoke of families back in Germany, of cities reduced to rubble, of children who had not seen butter or real meat in months. The dissonance was unbearable. How could their captors, the enemy, feed them better than their own government had fed their families? Each morning the women were awakened by minding a whistle, not a shout. They washed at communal sinks, supplied with cold but clean water. They stood for roll call, their names checked against lists held by soldiers who executed the task with mechanical precision. Then came breakfast, and it was at breakfast, on the 4th day of Greta's captivity, that she encountered something that would haunt her memory for the rest of her life. The mess tent smelled different that morning. Instead of the usual oatmeal or canned fruit, the air was thick with the scent of baking. When Greta reached the serving line, the cook placed 2 golden brown biscuits on her tray, then ladled a thick, creamy gravy over them. The gravy was studded with crumbles of sausage, rich and savoury, steaming in the cool morning air. Greta did not know what to call it. She had never seen such a dish, but as she sat and took her first bite, the combination of flaky biscuit and peppery gravy flooded her senses with warmth. It was comfort food, the kind of meal that spoke of abundance, of kitchens where waste was unthinkable because there was always more. Around her, women were eating in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces. Ilse sat across from Greta, clutching her fork as though it were a lifeline. "My daughter," she whispered, her voice breaking. "My daughter has not eaten meat in 6 months. And we are eating this." The guilt was crushing. Greta thought of her younger brother, conscripted at 16, sent to the Eastern Front, his letters home describing hunger that gnawed at him constantly. She thought of her mother in Hamburg, scavenging through ruins for scraps of coal to heat their apartment. And here she sat, a prisoner of war, eating better than she had eaten in years. The biscuits and gravy became a symbol. Not of American generosity, though that was part of it, but of the vast, unbridgeable gulf between what Germany had become and what America was. It was a revelation delivered not through speeches or propaganda, but through food, through the simple, undeniable fact that even in captivity, even behind barbed wire, the Americans had so much that they could afford to give comfort to their enemies. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued. Meals arrived with startling regularity. Meat, vegetables, bread, coffee, real coffee, not the ersatz brew made from acorns that Greta had choked down for years. The women gained weight, colour returned to their cheeks, and with physical recovery came psychological reckoning. In the barracks at night, conversations shifted. The die-hard loyalists, the women who still clung to belief in the Führer's ultimate victory, grew quieter. How could they maintain faith in a regime that had starved its people while the enemy fed its prisoners? The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, served 3 times a day on metal trays. Greta found herself drawn to the fence during the afternoons, watching the American soldiers move about their duties. They were so young, many of them. Farm boys from the Midwest, she would later learn, or factory workers from cities she had never heard of. They played baseball in a clearing near the camp perimeter, their laughter carrying on the wind. They sang songs she did not recognize, melodies that sounded strange and foreign but undeniably alive. One soldier, noticing her watching, approached the fence. He was tall, freckled, with red hair that stuck out from beneath his helmet. He said something in English, smiling, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a chocolate bar. He held it through the wire. Greta hesitated, then took it. The wrapper crinkled in her hands, the word Hershey's printed in bold letters she could not fully comprehend. That night, she shared the chocolate with Ilse and 2 other women. They broke it into small pieces, letting each square melt slowly on their tongues. It was impossibly sweet, richer than anything Greta remembered, and as she savoured it, she understood that this too was a weapon. Not a weapon of war, but a weapon of ideology. Every meal, every cigarette, every bar of chocolate was proof that the world Germany had tried to build, a world of sacrifice and scarcity and endless struggle, had been defeated not just on the battlefield, but in the very foundations of its philosophy. America had won because it could afford to be kind, because its abundance was so vast that feeding prisoners was not a sacrifice but a routine. By mid-May, news filtered into the camp. Germany had surrendered, the war was over. The announcement was met not with jubilation but with numb silence. For Greta and the other women, the end of the war meant only uncertainty. Where would they go? Their homes were rubble, their families scattered, the nation they had served no longer existed. And yet, in the days following the surrender, the Americans continued to feed them. Biscuits and gravy appeared again one morning, and Greta ate slowly, savouring every bite, knowing that this strange kindness would soon end. Knowing that when she returned to Germany, if she returned, she would face a world of hunger and ruin. But for now, in this barbed wire enclosure, somewhere in Bavaria, she ate and wept, and tried to make sense of a kindness she had never been taught to expect. The peculiar routine of captivity settled over the camp like a heavy blanket. For Greta and the other women, each day began with the same ritual. The morning whistle at 6 o'clock, the shuffle to wash stations where cold water ran from spigots into metal basins, the formation for roll call where American guards counted heads with clipboards and pencils. Then, breakfast. And it was breakfast that continued to unmoor everything the women thought they understood about their situation. The American cooks rotated through different menus, though Greta could not discern any pattern. Some mornings brought oatmeal studded with raisins and sweetened with brown sugar. Other mornings offered scrambled eggs, impossibly yellow and fluffy, accompanied by strips of bacon that crackled with fat. But it was the mornings when biscuits and gravy appeared that struck deepest. The dish had become a kind of touchstone among the women, whispered about in the barracks, anticipated with a mixture of longing and guilt that none of them could fully articulate. Ilse, the former nurse, tried to explain it one evening as they lay in their bunks. "It's not just food," she said quietly. "It's what the food means. Every bite is evidence. Evidence that we were wrong about everything." Another woman, Maria, a radio operator from Berlin, responded with bitterness. "Or evidence that they want us to feel grateful, to make us complicit in our own defeat." But even as she said it, her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach, fuller now than it had been in months. The argument was hollow, and she knew it. The guards themselves remained an enigma. They were not cruel, but neither were they friendly in any overt way. They maintained professional distance, enforcing rules without apparent malice. When a woman broke camp regulations by attempting to barter her extra blanket for cigarettes, the punishment was not violence, but extra duty, sweeping the mess hall for 3 days. When another woman fell ill with fever, she was taken immediately to the camp infirmary where an American medic treated her with sulfur drugs that were in desperately short supply back in Germany. The care was competent, even gentle, and it left the women more confused than ever. Greta noticed small gestures that did not fit the narrative of conquerors and conquered. A guard who helped an elderly woman carry water buckets to the barracks, another who looked away when women extended conversations past the designated times. Once, she saw a young soldier share his ration of chewing gum with a group of women working in the camp garden, distributing the sticks with the same casual generosity she had witnessed with the chocolate. These were not the actions of men taught to hate. They were the actions of men who saw the women not as enemies but as problems to be managed, tasks to be completed, human beings to be processed through a system. The tension between propaganda and reality created fractures within the camp population. Some women clung desperately to their faith in the Reich, insisting in whispered conversations that the abundance was temporary, that the Americans would soon reveal their true nature. These women formed a tight cluster in one corner of the barracks, refusing to engage with those they viewed as traitors. But their numbers dwindled as weeks passed. It was difficult to maintain ideological purity on a full stomach. Others, like Greta, found themselves adrift. She had believed, not fanatically perhaps, but sincerely. She had believed that Germany was fighting for survival, that the enemies surrounding them were bent on destruction, that sacrifice today would secure prosperity tomorrow. The biscuits and gravy made a mockery of those beliefs. How could a nation bent on Germany's destruction feed its prisoners better than Germany had fed its own people? The logic collapsed under the weight of evidence served 3 times daily. Letters became another battleground. The Americans allowed the women to write home, though every letter was censored, inspected by translators who marked through any mention of troop movements or camp locations. Greta sat for hours with a pencil and paper, trying to compose something truthful to her mother. How could she describe this? How could she explain that she was eating meat and bread and drinking real coffee while Hamburg burned and her family starved? In the end, she wrote only that she was safe, that she was being treated according to international conventions, that she hoped to see them soon. The truth was too large, too complicated, too painful to fit on the page. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The work details began in early June. The war had ended, but the administrative machinery of occupation required labor. The women were divided into groups based on skills. Those with medical training, like Ilse, were assigned to help in the camp infirmary, changing bandages and distributing medicine under American supervision. Those with clerical experience were put to work filing documents and organizing records. Greta, with her background in radio operations, found herself assigned to a laundry detail, scrubbing uniforms in massive steel tubs filled with hot water and harsh soap. The work was exhausting but not cruel. They labored in shifts, 6 hours a day, with breaks for water and rest. The American supervisors enforced productivity, but did not drive them mercilessly. And at the end of each shift, there was food. Always food. Lunch arrived in metal containers carried by kitchen workers, sandwiches made with thick slices of ham and cheese, apples that crunched with sweetness, canteens of lemonade that tasted like summer. Greta ate mechanically at first, trying not to think about her brother, trying not to imagine what he might be eating in whatever Soviet camp now held him. One afternoon, while carrying a basket of clean linens to the storage building, Greta passed the American mess hall. The door stood open, and she glimpsed the interior. Rows of tables where soldiers sat eating, laughing, arguing over card games. The kitchen beyond was visible through a serving window, and what she saw made her stop. Massive stoves, industrial refrigerators, shelves stacked with canned goods that reached to the ceiling. A cook was preparing what looked like hundreds of portions, moving with practiced efficiency. The sheer scale of it was staggering. This was not a special depot. This was routine, standard, the everyday logistics of feeding an army that had crossed an ocean and conquered a continent. A guard noticed her standing there and gestured for her to keep moving. She did, but the image stayed with her. That night in the barracks, she tried to describe what she had seen. They have so much, she told Ilse. Not just food. Everything. Equipment, supplies, vehicles. We were told they were soft, that they lacked the will to fight. But they had the will. They just also had everything else. Ilse nodded slowly. My husband wrote to me once from the Eastern Front. He said the Americans gave the Soviets thousands of trucks, while we were using horses. I thought he was exaggerating. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. He wasn't, was he? The question hung in the air. None of them answered because they all knew. The Reich had lied about America's weakness, about its decadence, about its inability to sustain a war effort. Every lie had been stripped away by the simple reality of material abundance, by trucks and tanks and planes, by chocolate and cigarettes and biscuits with gravy, by the overwhelming, undeniable fact that while Germany had demanded sacrifice from its people, America had built a war machine so vast it could afford generosity even to its enemies. July brought changes. The temporary camp was being closed, its population redistributed. Some women were being released, sent back to whatever remained of their homes. Others, particularly those who had served in more sensitive positions, were being transferred to larger detention centers for further processing. Greta learned that she would be among those transferred, her background in signals work flagging her for additional questioning. The news brought neither relief nor despair. She had nowhere to go. Hamburg was rubble. Her mother had not responded to any letters. Her brother was missing. The camp, with its barbed wire and roll calls, had become the only stability she knew. On her last morning at the camp, biscuits and gravy appeared on the breakfast menu. Greta took her tray and sat with Ilse and Maria, women who had become something like sisters through shared captivity. They ate slowly, savouring each bite. The gravy was thick and peppery, the biscuits golden and warm. Around them, other women did the same, eating in silence broken only by the occasional sniffle or stifled sob. It was absurd, Greta thought, to weep over breakfast, but the tears came anyway. "Do you think we'll eat like this again?" Maria asked. Her voice was small, almost childlike. Ilse shook her head. "Not for a long time. Germany is starving. We'll be lucky to have bread and water." Greta wiped her eyes and forced herself to finish the biscuits. She would need the calories. The future promised nothing but scarcity. The transfer happened in the afternoon. Trucks arrived, canvas-covered and rumbling, and the women climbed into the beds with their meagre belongings. Greta carried only a small cloth bundle, an extra shirt, a pair of socks, and hidden at the bottom, carefully wrapped, the Hershey's wrapper from that first chocolate bar. She did not know why she kept it. Perhaps as evidence, perhaps as a reminder that kindness, however unexpected, had existed. The new camp was larger, more permanent, located near what had once been a Wehrmacht training facility. The buildings were concrete and brick, designed to withstand winter, surrounded by higher fences and more guard towers. Greta was processed again, questioned this time by an intelligence officer who spoke halting German. The questions were routine. Her duties during the war, the units she had worked with, whether she had been a party member. She answered truthfully, mechanically, and was assigned to a barracks with 30 other women. The food at the new camp was different, still abundant by German standards, but more institutional, less varied. Breakfast was often oatmeal or bread with jam, lunch was soup and crackers. Dinner brought stews or casseroles, filling but monotonous. Biscuits and gravy did not appear on the menu. Greta found herself missing them with an intensity that embarrassed her. It was foolish to fixate on a single meal, but that dish had become symbolic, a representation of everything the camp had forced her to confront. Weeks turned into months. Summer faded into autumn. The women worked, ate, slept, and waited. News from Germany filtered in slowly. Cities were being rebuilt, but hunger remained endemic. The occupation zones had divided the country into sectors: American, British, French, and Soviet. Millions were displaced, wandering through rubble looking for lost family members. The full scope of the concentration camps had been revealed. Photographs and testimonies that made Greta feel sick with shame and disbelief. She had not known. She told herself that she had not known the full extent of what had been done in Germany's name, but ignorance felt like complicity. In October, Ilse was released. She came to Greta's bunk the night before her departure, her face drawn with worry. "I don't know what I'll find," she admitted. "My husband is dead. My son is missing. My home in Dresden is gone. But I have to go. I have to try." Greta embraced her, feeling the sharp edges of the older woman's shoulders through her shirt. "Write to me if you can," Greta said. "Tell me what it's like out there," Ilse promised, though both of them knew the postal system was chaos. The next morning, she was gone. The barracks felt emptier after that. More women were released as autumn progressed, deemed no longer a security risk, sent back to a Germany that existed more in memory than reality. Greta remained. Her case was complicated by her signals work, by questions about encryption and communication networks. She answered interrogators patiently, explaining technical details that seemed increasingly irrelevant. The war was over. The Reich was dead. What did it matter now, who had transmitted what orders? December brought the first snow. With it came an unexpected change in the camp routine. The Americans announced a Christmas celebration, an effort to lift morale among the remaining prisoners. Greta did not know what to expect. Christmas under the Reich had become a militarized holiday, stripped of religious meaning, transformed into a celebration of strength and sacrifice. But the Americans approached it differently. On Christmas Eve, the mess hall was decorated with pine branches and paper chains made by the prisoners. A small tree stood in one corner, draped with strings of popcorn. The women were served a special meal: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and for dessert, slices of apple pie. It was not home, it was not her mother's stollen or the caroling she remembered from childhood, but it was generous, deliberately, almost aggressively generous. And then, as if the cooks had read her mind, as if they knew what she had been missing, the next morning's breakfast brought biscuits and gravy. Greta stood in line, tray extended, watching the thick white gravy ladle over golden biscuits, and something broke inside her. She carried her tray to a table, sat down, and began to eat through tears she could not control. Around her, other women did the same. Some wept quietly, others ate in silence, their faces betraying nothing. But everyone understood. This was not just food. This was a reminder of everything they had lost, everything they had been, everything that could never be again. A guard noticed the crying and looked uncomfortable. He said something to a colleague, who shrugged. They did not intervene. They let the women eat and weep and process whatever they needed to process. And in that small mercy, Greta found something unexpected. Not forgiveness, exactly. Not absolution for the war or the suffering or the destruction, but acknowledgement. The Americans saw them not as monsters, not as the enemy, but as women. Defeated, yes. Broken, certainly, but still human, still deserving of a hot meal on Christmas morning. January of 1946 brought Greta's release. The paperwork arrived without ceremony, processed by clerks who handed her a travel document and directions to a displaced persons centre in Munich. She was given a small parcel of food for the journey: bread, cheese, a can of meat, and 2 Hershey's bars. The irony was not lost on her. Even in release, the Americans fed her. She left the camp on a grey morning, walking through gates that had confined her for 8 months. Outside, the world was frozen and bleak. Snow covered the roads. Villages lay in ruins. Refugees streamed past in both directions, hollow-eyed and desperate. Greta joined them, carrying her cloth bundle, walking toward Munich and whatever future awaited there. The journey took 3 days. She slept in barns and church basements, sharing space with other displaced people. She ate the food the Americans had given her sparingly, making it last, and each night, lying on cold floors with strangers, she thought about biscuits and gravy, about the mornings in the mess tent when steam rose from her tray and the smell of pepper and sausage filled the air, about the impossible kindness of being fed by the enemy. Munich was chaos. The displaced persons centre was overwhelmed, processing thousands daily. Greta waited in lines, filled out forms, answered questions. She was assigned temporary housing in a former school building where 200 women slept on the floor. Rations were distributed weekly: bread, potatoes, a small tin of fat. It was enough to survive but not to live. The contrast with camp food was devastating. Greta found work eventually, cleaning rubble from bombed buildings for a few marks a week. The labour was backbreaking, the pay barely sufficient. But it was something. She shared a room with 4 other women, all former prisoners or refugees. They pooled resources, scavenged for coal. bartered what little they had for extra food, and at night, when hunger gnawed and cold seeped through walls, they talked about the camps, about the Americans, about the food. "Do you remember the chocolate?" one woman asked. "I think about it constantly," another admitted. "Not because I'm hungry. Well, yes, because I'm hungry. But also because it was proof that somewhere in the world people still lived like that. With abundance, with waste." Greta listened but said little. She thought about the biscuits, about the gravy, about the mornings when she had eaten until she was full, truly full, for the first time in years. She had taken it for granted then, focused on the barbed wire and the guards and the uncertainty. Only now, living on thin soup and black bread, did she understand what had been given to her. Spring came slowly to Munich. The rubble was cleared street by street. Food supplies improved marginally. Greta received word that her mother had survived, living in a refugee camp near Bremen. Her brother remained missing, likely dead in a Soviet camp or a forgotten grave. She wrote letters, trying to explain where she had been, what she had experienced. But how could she tell her mother that she had eaten better as a prisoner than as a citizen of the Reich? How could she describe the kindness without sounding like a traitor? By summer, life had established a new rhythm. Greta found steadier work in an American quartermaster's office, typing inventory reports in exchange for better rations. The Americans she worked with were polite but distant, focused on their duties. Sometimes, walking past the American mess hall on her way home, she smelled familiar scents: coffee, bacon, biscuits baking. The memories flooded back with overwhelming force. One evening, a cook she had befriended, a sergeant from Texas, noticed her lingering near the mess hall door. He called her over and handed her a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. "Leftover biscuits," he said in broken German. "Take them." Greta accepted with trembling hands. That night, alone in her room, she unwrapped the bundle. 2 biscuits, cold but still soft. She ate them slowly, dry, without gravy, and wept. Not from sadness, exactly, not from joy, but from the weight of memory, from the knowledge that a simple meal had become the measure of everything she had lost and everything she had learned. Years later, when Germany had rebuilt and prosperity returned, when Greta had married and raised children and told them carefully edited stories about the war, she still thought about biscuits and gravy. She made attempts to recreate the dish, following American recipes, but it never tasted the same. Perhaps because the ingredients were different, perhaps because the context could never be replicated. That food had been served in a moment of collapse, when everything she believed had crumbled, and she had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about her nation, her leaders, and herself. The biscuits and gravy had not been just sustenance. They had been evidence that the propaganda had been lies, evidence that the enemy possessed not just military might, but a civilization capable of generosity even in victory. Evidence that Germany's sacrifice had been for nothing, that the path chosen had led only to ruin. Every bite had been a small death of certainty, a forced reckoning with reality. And in the decades that followed, as Germany grappled with its past, as testimonies emerged and histories were written, Greta carried that memory. She told her children about the war, about the defeat, about the occupation, but she rarely spoke of the food. It seemed too small, too trivial, too personal. How could a meal matter in the face of millions dead, cities destroyed, a nation divided? Yet it had mattered. To her, it mattered enormously, because in that mess tent, eating biscuits covered in peppery gravy, she had understood viscerally, undeniably, that everything she had been taught was wrong. The Americans had not been weak. They had been strong enough to be kind. They had not been decadent. They had built an industrial civilization capable of feeding armies and prisoners alike. They had not been barbaric. They had followed rules, maintained order, treated their enemies with a dignity that the Reich had never shown to its own people. The biscuits and gravy had been proof of all of this, served on a metal tray 3 times a week, impossible to deny or explain away. The displaced persons centre in Munich became Greta's world through the bitter winter of 1946 into 47. She watched as other women found relatives, secured passage to other countries, or simply disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe. But Greta remained, her status complicated by bureaucratic tangles and the simple fact that she had nowhere else to go. Hamburg, her home, existed now only as a photograph in her memory, the actual city reduced to skeletal ruins, where her mother struggled to survive in conditions Greta could barely imagine from the relative safety of the American zone. The canteen at the Displaced Persons Center served food that kept people alive but little more. Thin porridge in the mornings, vegetable soup at midday, bread and margarine in the evenings. It was rationed, measured, sufficient for survival but devoid of comfort. Greta ate mechanically, her mind often drifting back to those mornings in the camp when breakfast had meant something more than mere calories. She tried to explain it once to a woman who had spent the war in Berlin, who had never been captured, never experienced American captivity. "You cannot understand," Greta said, struggling to find words. "It was not just that they fed us, it was how they fed us. With food that had flavour, warmth, richness, as if we mattered, as if feeding us properly was simply what decent people did." The woman looked at her skeptically. "You sound as if you miss being a prisoner." The accusation stung because there was truth in it. Not that Greta missed captivity itself, the barbed wire, the uncertainty, the shame, but she missed the strange security of knowing that each day would bring 3 meals, that hunger would not gnaw at her constantly, that the immediate future was predictable even if the distant future remained opaque. In March of 1947, nearly 2 years after her capture, Greta received word that she could apply for emigration. The Americans were facilitating travel for displaced persons to countries willing to accept them. Canada needed workers. Australia sought settlers. Argentina welcomed Europeans. Greta filled out applications mechanically, listing skills and qualifications, trying to imagine a life in places she could not picture. But before any answers came, an unexpected letter arrived from her mother. The envelope was thin, the paper inside covered in cramped handwriting. Her mother had found work in Bremen, cleaning for British occupation forces. She had secured a small room, barely more than a closet, but it was a shelter, and most importantly, she wrote, she had news of Greta's brother. He was alive, captured by the Soviets, yes, but confirmed alive in a camp near the Ural Mountains. The relief was crushing. Greta read the letter 3 times, tears blurring the words, before she allowed herself to believe it. She applied for travel permits the next day. The process took weeks, but finally, in late April, she boarded a train heading north. The journey through Western Germany revealed the full scope of destruction. Cities that had once been industrial centres now stood as forests of broken concrete and twisted steel. Refugees moved along roads in endless columns. Children, hollow-eyed and silent, watched from the ruins. The contrast with the order and abundance of the American camp struck Greta with renewed force. That had been an island of stability in a sea of chaos, a fragment of a functional civilization transplanted into the heart of German collapse. Bremen was cold and grey when she arrived. Her mother met her at the station, and for a long moment they simply held each other. 2 women who had survived, who had endured, who had lost so much but still drew breath. Her mother was thinner than Greta remembered, her hair completely white now, her hands rough from labour. But she was alive. That night, in the tiny room her mother called home, they shared a meal of potatoes and onions fried in a precious spoonful of fat. It was meagre, but they ate slowly, savouring each bite, grateful for warmth and family, and the simple fact of being together. Greta told her mother about the camps, carefully at first, then with increasing honesty. She described the food, the routines, the strange kindness of captors, who had every reason to hate. Her mother listened in silence, her face unreadable. Finally she spoke. "Your brother wrote something similar from the East, before the letters stopped. He said the worst part was not the hunger or the cold, but realizing how completely we had been lied to, about everything." She paused, stirring the potatoes absently. "We sacrificed everything for nothing, our sons, our cities, our future, all for lies." The bitterness in her mother's voice was new, Or perhaps Greta had simply never heard it before. They had believed, both of them. Not fanatically, but sincerely. They had trusted that the suffering had purpose, that the sacrifices would be justified by victory, or at least by the righteousness of the cause. The biscuits and gravy, the chocolate bars, the casual abundance of the American camps had stripped away that final illusion. The Reich had demanded everything and given nothing. The Americans had demanded nothing and given food, shelter, and dignity. Greta found work in Bremen within a week, translating documents for British administrators. The pay was modest but regular, and it allowed her to contribute to the household she now shared with her mother. They lived frugally, saving what they could, waiting for word of her brother's release. The Soviets were slower to repatriate prisoners, using them as labor to rebuild what the Wehrmacht had destroyed. It would be years, they knew, before he came home, if he came home. But life continued. Germany rebuilt, slowly, painfully. Greta saw the familiar trucks, the same olive-drab vehicles that had rolled past her column of prisoners in April of 1945, now delivering flour and coal and machinery. The irony was not lost on her. The nation that had conquered them was now feeding them again, rebuilding what the war had destroyed. Decades later, when Germany had become prosperous again, when the scars of war had faded from the landscape if not from memory, Greta would still think about those mornings in the camp. She would smell pepper or sausage, and suddenly she would be 23 again, standing in line with a metal tray, watching gravy ladle over golden biscuits. The memory never lost its power. It remained vivid, immediate, a moment of clarity when everything she had believed collapsed, and she was forced to see the world as it actually was. She told her grandchildren about the war, when they were old enough to understand. She told them about defeat and hunger and loss, but she also told them about the biscuits and gravy, about the unexpected kindness that had taught her more than any battle or speech or ideology. She told them that sometimes the smallest gestures reveal the deepest truths, that a meal shared can be more powerful than a weapon, that humanity persists even in the darkest moments. And when they asked her what she had learned from the war, she thought carefully before answering. She said finally, that abundance is a kind of power, not just military power, but moral power. The Americans defeated us not just with tanks and planes, but with the simple fact that they could afford to be kind. They fed us when we were hungry, treated us with dignity when we expected cruelty, and in doing so, they showed us that everything we had been taught was a lie. That was the real defeat. Not on the battlefield, but in a mess tent over biscuits and gravy, when we finally understood that we had been fighting for a cause that was already lost before it began. The biscuits and gravy became, in the end, more than just a memory of food. They became a symbol of the moment when certainty shattered, when propaganda collided with reality, when a defeated woman learned that the enemy was more humane than her own leaders had ever been. It was a lesson delivered not through speeches or force, but through the simple, devastating kindness of a hot meal served behind barbed wire. And it was a lesson that Greta Hoffman carried with her for the rest of her long life, a quiet testament to the power of generosity to transform understanding, even in the midst of war. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.